Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Scale2Sell Interviews. Today, I'm talking to Christophe Bureau. Hi.
Hello, François-Joseph.
Christophe, today we're going to talk about an adventure called DotDot, but I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us about your background.
Yeah, thank you very much. My background is in science. I studied physics at the École Normale Supérieure and then joined the CEA, where I spent 10 years. There, I created a technology that was then spun off from the CEA and gave rise to a startup called Alchemedics, which makes coatings for vascular implants. And I sold that company in 2012, so that gave me my first experience. So I made the transition from researcher to entrepreneur around that time.
Now, how would you describe this transition from researcher to entrepreneur? How do you prepare for it?
You don't know where it comes from. Closest comparable is falling in love. You don't know why, and you can't explain why your life suddenly takes a different direction. So it was like a storm under a skull, but after all, I've got a career path that promises me a great career at the CEA, so why should I do anything else? And the solution came from my wife's family, who one day said to me, well, what can you live with, failure or regret? And she summed it all up in a few words. So in the end, I made my choice based on that. So it wasn't planned at all.
So this adventure lasted from when to when?
It started about 1999 until 2012 when I sold the company. And today, the technology that was created by Alchemedics is implanted in about 2 million people on the planet. And it has to be used. So it's really a technology that has brought about a major breakthrough in the field of interventional cardiology.
Gee, what's more, I believe you're a user, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. In spite of myself, I had a little event in October 2001 when I came out of COVID, and I actually have stents in my chest, except that they're stents that carry my technology, so it wasn't planned that way, but it's come full circle.
Understood. Sometimes innovation is good for you too. Who did you sell this company to?
I sold it to a company called Sinomed, which is a major stent player in China, but actually sells worldwide. They have been approved in the United States, Japan, and Europe. Their stents are reimbursed in France, and they are a global player. There are a lot of American players, there are 2 or 3 Chinese players, and there are 1 or 2 Japanese players. Those are pretty much the main players. Unfortunately, there aren't many players in this field in Europe.
Right then. What did you do after the sale?
I had to step away for a while to attend to something else. I wanted to get back in touch with other fields in which I wasn't particularly fluent, so I went into the pharmaceutical industry for a while, wanting to educate myself on the subject. I joined Becton Dickinson, the syringe leader, which helped me gain insights into the pharmaceutical industry and learn extensively. And to understand a lot of things. I had also tried again to set up startups, which unfortunately failed because that happens in the digital sector, in particular for the pharmaceutical industry, in the field of monitoring patient compliance with treatment. Then I landed as Director of Innovation at Valeo, so I was recruited surprisingly because I knew nothing about cars. I bumped into a smart boss who is now CTO of Valeo and who told me that if we wanted an automotive engineer, we would have recruited him internally. What we're interested in is precisely that you can make some of our subjects your own and make them your own with your own culture. And I was told, rejuvenate the windshield wiper business for us. That's it. We do €1 billion in business. We make a 2% margin. How do you see it? We've tried everything. We've tried wear markers. We've tried QR codes on the boxes. People always change their wipers far too late than we'd like, so what do you think? And that's when I looked at the problem with my own bias and said to myself, there's 40% market share, which means that if we do a quick calculation, 2 cars equipped with Valeo wipers are less than 150 meters apart. And as a joke, I said, if they were equipped with a little communication module, that means you'd be a cell phone operator. Everyone laughed because that's obviously not the company's business. And then finally, once the laughter had died down, we said to ourselves, well, that's funny, maybe we could give it a try and see what happens. And that's where the idea for the DotDot embryo came from. Then COVID caught up with us. I left Vallejo at that point. In fact, I continued to work on the DotDot idea during COVID, so it's largely a COVID innovation. We made the first prototypes during this period and decided to create the company at the end of 2021 with a co-founder who was a specialist in corporate strategy, and our paths had crossed when I was at Vallejo.
Before you left for DotDot, didn't you have the urge for a moment to go back to being a researcher and return to that world?
Now, that's a difficult question. It's a difficult question. When I made the decision to stop being a researcher and become an entrepreneur, I was at a point in my life where I felt that what I had to demonstrate I had done. In other words, my contribution. There are times in one's life when, on a given subject, one can be on fire, and this fire may not last. I think that when I got there, I had demonstrated 2 or 3 things that enabled me to spin off from the CEA with the technology I had invented there. And it was precisely by cracking 2 or 3 problems that had existed for a decade. So I was convinced that there were still many other things to do, many other things to understand, but that wasn't me anymore. So now in retrospect, going back to being a researcher seems to me to be a profession, a fine profession first and foremost, a very, very fine profession, which is justified only by itself. I don't see the point of justifying research by the applications it can generate. So yes, I'd love to have the freedom to be a paid intellectual stroller again. It's not easy being an intellectual stroller. You arrive at 8:30 in the morning, go ahead and stroll now. That's not easy. So it's a difficult job from that point of view. So maybe one day, by the time I've sold DotDot, I'll think that maybe I'll go back to doing this, and it'll be for the simple pleasure of having this kind of intellectual wandering that characterizes me quite well.
Interesting. So now DotDot, beyond making windshield wipers communicate, what is it? Who's it for? And why did you do it?
Well, that's a shortcut. So just for the anecdote, in fact, the DotDot logo, when you go to the DotDot.defr website, you see, in fact, the logo. It's a Wi-Fi formed by a windshield wiper that moves. And that's the historical vestige of DotDot's youth. In fact, what came out of that joke was that any crowd is a potential network. In other words, all you have to do is equip it correctly with what you need on each point, on each node. But a crowd of cars, a crowd of people, a crowd of bicycles, a crowd of cows can be a network. It's just a matter of being able to place the nodes that will create a meshed network. And in fact, that was the first value proposition. In the end, we were able to identify situations in which this was the case. And the automotive industry in particular was one of the sectors where this could be of interest. So we continued to work a lot on B2B at the start. Then one day, while technically working on the Dot, I found myself taking a trip to the mountains with family and friends. And then we needed to look at the maps we were on, and I was the only one with an operator whose network passed through. So as a game, I took out a Dot I always had in my pocket, paired it with my phone, and for the rest of the day, they were able to connect to the internet on my Dot. And by evening, with help of fondue and wine, we said to ourselves, this isn't such a bad thing because it means we can share. That's where the consideration of anonymity came in, because it's not easy to share the name of your shared connection with people you don't know. And then finally, maybe we could, those who have a lot of GBs on their phone could share it with those who don't have many. In short, all this led to a kind of global brainstorming that turned DotDot around from a B2B network, I'd say a fairly pure one, to an idea that was much simpler, which was that thanks to a Dot that I can attach to my phone, and I can share GBs. Let's define the rules and modalities so that it becomes an act of digital solidarity. And that's how we really started working in this direction.
Can you show us what the Dot looks like and how it works?
Here. Sure, so here's a little Dot prototype. It's still a little bigger compared to what it actually represents, but the Dot prototype is a pocket-sized device with an electronic board, a Wi-Fi radio inside, and a battery. So you can't really see an LED that lights up and automatically connects to my phone. And then 100 meters around me, I create a Wi-Fi network called DotDot that everyone can see. And then I have a default password, which is something I make public. This means that anyone who comes across a DotDot network on the TGV between Grenoble and Paris and sees a DotDot network can connect to it. But it also means that I can share my GBs, which is why we've created an application called DotDot. Normally, when you see a Wi-Fi network, you press on it, and then a little window pops up giving you a Wi-Fi password. With DotDot, it's different. When you press on the DotDot network, the app opens and you find out whether the person sharing their GBs is sharing them for free or for a fee. So in this case, you can do one or the other. I can decide that I'm going to share 5 GBs for free, or I can decide that I'm going to put my GBs up for sale and I'm going to sell 10 of them. And at that point in the app, you can go and make a transaction. I don't have to buy 10 GBs. I can buy 5 if I feel like it. In short, it's the first on-demand mobile internet access offer. It doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet. So it's the first time that people can finally say to themselves, I can't afford to buy a subscription, and so I can finally go and buy a gigabyte by the gram just to be able to use it.
Back in the 20s, projects like this didn't emerge from people sharing their Wi-Fi as a community.
Yes, of course there are. Today it still exists. We've all come across free Wi-Fi secure networks all over the place in cities and in buildings. And all the operators today have a global offer. But that means it's only available to subscribers of the said operator. In other words, you already have to be a subscriber to Freebox. You already have to have a box and pay a little more than 30 euros a month. You may also need a mobile subscription to go with it. So we're really in a category that's not the target category for us. Our target category is people who may even not have a SIM card. They don't have the possibility of going online, so they can do it on public Wi-Fi. In our case, it just so happens that this is also a type of access that will be offered to them, which has a higher level of security than public Wi-Fi, for reasons that can be explained fairly easily. But in the end, it allows you to come across a population of people who are likely to be sharing anywhere.
So in fact, to be clear and for the audience to understand, on the one hand, there are people who offer access to their smartphone. Well, not their smartphone, but their mobile internet access plan. And on the other hand, there are people who use it.
That's it. In our jargon, we call them doters and doties. So the doters are those who are going to pair a dot with their phone and who will be able to share their GBs. And then on the other side, we'll have the doties, who are those who come to use them and buy GBs by the gram. These can be typical users. A typical doter is someone who has a fairly generous GB mobile subscription and is aware that in the end, they're having a hard time finding the plan they're looking for. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that the average consumption of GBs in France is 15 GBs, and that only 10% of subscriptions are between 10 and 20. Most subscriptions are either well below 10 or above 30. So that means that every month, the only real choice you have with your mobile subscription is either I waste or I overspend. And that's the starting point.
I think that with free, my children have 350 gigabytes and that I won't be able to see them use it. I hope they will not be able to use them all in a single month.
Having a 16-year-old son who's a video gamer, you may not have the full story yet.
No, I hope I never get to that level.
But it's true that today's subscriptions are getting really oversized. And in fact, I think everyone realizes that it's a marketing argument, which means that when you divide the real price of the subscription, not by 350, but by 15, you get a real price for what a GB represents, and that a GB in the end remains relatively expensive. So for people who can't afford a subscription, this means that it's probably suitable for 75% of the population, but there are still between 20 and 25% of people for whom it's going to be a budgetary arbitration in the individual budget. And for these people, it can be interesting. So it's not necessarily just poor people. It can be students, quite simply, who don't necessarily all start life with a 350 GB subscription. It also depends on their situation. So university campuses can be very, very good targets for us, where we're going to see potential doters and doties living side by side in the same place. And as far as we know from the field surveys we've been able to carry out and the trials we've been able to run on the campuses, it works quite well. They're really interested. It's something that's very important.
Is there a regulatory issue? Do you become an operator within the meaning of the law or not?
No. In fact, it's a very good question because we asked ourselves quite quickly, obviously, we're what you might call a matchmaking agency. We don't have, how shall I put it, the characteristics of a cell phone operator. That doesn't exempt us from taking a certain number of precautions, particularly in terms of security. I'm going to share my GBs with my DOT. Somebody's going to connect to it and do reprehensible things with it. I don't want to be held responsible for what happens over that connection. So obviously we've planned for that. And we have to respect constraints that are similar to those of the anti-terrorist law. These include the possibility of tracing, not people, but to be able to trace cell phone numbers. In other words, to connect to DotDot, the doter, like the dotee, enters their mobile number, receives a validation SMS, then they can do what they have to do with their transaction. If the police ever come to us and say that we'd like to know if at a given time there were any reprehensible things done from such and such an hour to such and such an hour in such and such an area, we're able at that point to provide the telephone numbers at the request of the law, and they'll take care of finding out who it is because we're not able to find out who it is.
And in terms of utilization, a dotee has full access to all services. Or there are limitations that can be placed, for example, on streaming or other internet flows?
That's a good question. Today we have not considered restrictions, but I realize that since we've had the opportunity to raise the issue several times, this could also be a way of conserving the doter's resources to some extent. In the final analysis, these are choices that can be made by the doter. I'm willing to share, but not under any conditions. Helping people like this or like that is fine with me. If it's so that people can watch YouTube and take up all my bandwidth, I don't feel like it. Yes, it may represent a certain category of users. I think it'll have to be for us. Little by little, as we grow, we'll have to be better at identifying who our users are. Today we have a kind of offer, I won't say generic, but basic, which is simple and which is really an offer to share GBs. Some have GBs, others don't. And in the end, we're able to lower the link barrier between the two for mutual benefit. That's our baseline idea. After that, I think what you've just said represents a normal evolution, which is to finally manage to tier services based on the content we're able to offer.
International differences exist when deploying DotDot between countries. Today you deploy it in France and you're limited in what you can do abroad.
So there are limitations. First of all, there are no technical limitations. In other words, just as you can use a hotspot on a telephone, in fact, it's stateless. You can do it anywhere in France. We've already done it in India. We've already done it in China, even with devices that don't run iOS or Android. There's always the notion of connection sharing, so we can always do it. That poses absolutely no technical problem. There are also differences in terms of the motivations people may have for using DotDot. In France and a number of other European countries, solidarity is a springboard that works. Not for everyone, but it works at almost 30 to 40%. In other words, 30 to 40% of people questioned about the relevance of DotDot. On samples of 1,000 people say, yeah, I'm not interested in making money on my subscription. On the other hand, I'm willing to share to lend a hand, and then I'll share for free. But on average, a GB costs €1.5 or somewhere between 1.5 and 2 euros when you do the actual calculations. If you go to the United States, where the GB is over $6, well, all of a sudden, the notion of monetization is omnipresent. In other words, digital solidarity plays an extremely minor role, except perhaps more in some states than in others. But there's also this culture, if you like, of being able at some point to monetize in the same way as you buy a fleet of used cars and via Get Around, rent them out to whoever wants them and ultimately make a small income from it. The very notion of using DotDot as a potential source of income is much more present. It's also the case in certain African countries where we've been able to do a few surveys to see if we can do our own little business. Finally, from a purely regulatory point of view, the law is not the same in all countries. In some countries, the sharing of GBs is forbidden by the very contract signed with the operators, whereas in other countries it is tolerated. And as we're not selling GBs directly, but rather acting as an agency to put people who want to share their GBs in touch with each other, we're in any case exempt from a certain number of elements of this regulation. So in short, we probably won't be able to do it everywhere. We'll have to convince some mobile operators that it's in their interest, a bit like certain sharing applications like Split, where you can share your Netflix, your whatever, Spotify, etc., an absolutely remarkable application. And finally, one of the very strong arguments for operators like Netflix or others to tolerate and even encourage Split is that when you share your subscriptions with someone else, you're much more reluctant to interrupt them. And so in the end, it enables us to keep customers for much longer periods. And we think the same applies to cell phone subscriptions.
That's interesting. So you're getting involved? In what way today is the argument of the reduction of the digital divide an argument that is heard by your users?
First of all, we're not very well known. We're really just starting out. I think we're going to get a bit of coverage now with the prize we won at CES in Las Vegas. What's more,
I was going to get to that. Go ahead. Explain to the listeners what's up with the price.
every year in, I don't know, maybe 20 different categories, companies, startups in general, present their products, since it's a consumer electronics summit. So it's a consumer electronics show. It's really about products that will change the home, the car, smart cities, and so on. And we competed in the smart city category. And among all the startups that were presented, we were spotted. So today we're what's known as Innovation Honoree. In other words, we were awarded an innovation prize. And to give you a ratio among the group of French startups in which we had applied, there were 40 of them, 3 of them won a prize. So it's already a first selection with a certain level of rigor. Then in January, we'll be going to CES in Vegas, and this time we'll be competing for the best of innovation. In other words, all the companies that are innovation honorees still have a title above them. But let's just say that the innovation honorees are also companies that receive more press coverage than the standards. So we're thinking of leveraging all this, not so much to conquer the US market, but rather to rebound on the French market. Because it's a bit of a recurring theme every year when we talk about CES innovations. We certainly hope that everyone will hear about DotDot this year. And so that's essentially what we're banking on for our knowledge. But today we're obviously keeping a low profile until the whole thing blows over and gets exposure. That hasn't stopped us from trying to reach out to communities first, because as you can see, there have to be doters and doties in relatively close physical proximity, since the range of a dot is 100 meters. This means that you can't easily exchange GBs from one end of France to the other. In order to achieve this proximity, we needed to focus on communities that met these criteria. For example, I cited university campuses previously. There are other categories. There's the whole community of people involved in social support, in particular digital solidarity and the fight against the digital divide. This can take many forms. There are lots of associations, from Restos du Cœur to Emmaüs Connect and so on, all of which are relatively large communities where I'm told the first thing a homeless person asks for after a hot coffee or soup is an internet connection. And beyond a cup of coffee or a hot soup, the internet is quickly added to the list of things they need. Marauders often share their connections with different people. So the day we introduced them to DotDot, they said, "That's so cool, because now I don't have to share my phone password, so we'll go from there." The beauty of this is that, if you like, it attracts foundations. In particular, the foundations of certain large industrial groups, very large industrial groups, which suddenly say to themselves, it's almost a service, how can I put it, a CSR action in perspective that's easy for us to implement. Let me explain. We're currently talking to some of them about buying lots of dots in large quantities for all their employees and suddenly putting their employees in the position of being doters, i.e. being able to share their GBs in an environment. In a way, that's how we make ourselves known. For the time being, we're thinking a bit in packages, i.e. we're thinking that we'll maybe build a small community around a campus here, a small community around a campus there, and then it'll end up coalescing, i.e. we won't have a national rollout of the kind where everyone ends up equipped. I don't think that's how it's going to happen. I think that today we're banking on the idea that we're an extremely concrete tool for digital solidarity and sharing. Very, very easy to implement, where people can decide to do it for free or not, and it doesn't matter because it's useful in both cases. And that in the end attracts big players who will be able to get us to have a booster and increase the density of users. And that's actually what's happening here.
I am currently in search of an excellent book that delves into the art of community building. It's The Cold Start Problem by Andrew Chen. It was to me a great source of inspiration while I was creating Referral Squad. It's about how a lot of community innovations have managed to unfold from Uber, Tinder, and the like, starting from small communities and gradually growing to a community that's united. And that's just
And
it.
in fact, I think it's actually, and that makes sense anyway, financing a national rollout like that ex abrupto with a lot of advertising or things like that. I don't think that's been done for quite a few years now. And in any case, I don't think it's done in Europe. At the very least, it might be done in the United States, where the investment firepower isn't the same as here, but it doesn't make sense here. What's more, we really feel that we're a company with a mission in this respect. I think this mission is sufficiently robust and necessary for it to grow on its own. So that's what we're going to focus on, to be able to find big players who will at some point tell us that it's true that I like your stuff, and I'm ready to buy 10, 20, or 50,000 of them for my employees. What's more, we're going to run an educational campaign on the digital solidarity that goes with it. And there you have it. I think...
And that's your business model for selling dots today?
In the short term, yes. In the short term, it's a hardware business model because we need to build up an installed base before we can build slightly different business models around it. In the future, we may also enter the hardware business, not just in 2 years, but in the medium to long term. We'll probably also have a commission on transactions.
Okay.
Doter and Dotee will exchange GBs, will pay. It's a cent business, but on quantities that could become important with the projected transactions. And so I think that beyond the hardware business for the startup part, we could have a surge in revenues on aspects linked to the transaction commission.
Technically, it wasn't possible to do, so I think more on Android than iPhone, but an app to fulfill the dot function.
We've all tried it. We've all thought about it. The short answer is no, it's not possible. The reason for this is that, in fact, it's not even at the operator level. It's at the level of the lines of code in the phones. And today, you know that when one wants to make an application, one always wonders, what do you want? What phone functions can you control from the application?
Yes, the famous permissions.
That's it. Well, it's no secret. For example, when you're in the Apple environment, in the iOS environment, the simple fact of being able to list the Wi-Fis around you is something that's easily done by hand. You open your Wi-Fi settings, you see all the Wi-Fi you have around you. That, for example, is something you don't have access to as a developer. You can't list the Wi-Fis around from an app for reasons that Apple cites as being security reasons. Okay, fair enough, but in any case, it limits you on that. Well, just being able to share anonymously, you still have to have a process because you're thinking about what DotDot does. Is I turn on my dot, okay? I create a Wi-Fi around me and someone comes and connects to it who, for example, is someone who doesn't even have a SIM card. So that means it's someone who has no access to the internet. So how does he manage to borrow a few micrograms of internet from me so that he can identify himself on the server, and then we can go and check that his account exists and that he has all the prerogatives required to be able to connect? And at that point, the connection opens up so that he has internet access. Typically, this involves a number of functions on iOS, Android, or even a Huawei on which you don't have access. These are levels of code that are far too deep. Obviously, it would have been much better with an app, but in fact, there's no such thing. And the creation of the hardware means that on this hardware, we're the ones to manage what's feasible and what isn't.
Right then. So how did you design this hardware? Where is it manufactured?
Well, we designed it at the beginning with development boards. So it's a microcontroller that's widely available on the market. In fact, what really made DotDot smart was the embedded software that went with it. But that's how we started, on a corner of a table with something just plugged into the USB-C socket and then fingers in the code all day. And when it started working, I still remember the first day we saw the Wi-Fi start screaming around the room. So that was memorable because that's it, we've got it. And that allowed us to start making little networks with it. And now, little by little, we've refined it. The electronic board is no longer a development board that you buy off the shelf because it's a board that we designed ourselves with the functionalities we wanted. The only thing we can't make in Europe that we can't make in France is the microcontroller. So that's something because the Taiwanese are world market leaders and they have, let's say, half of everything that's made in the world. Half of all microcontrollers available to the general public. So for the time being, we're ordering our little processor from Taiwan. We're trying to see how we can switch to European manufacturers like Nordic in Europe or even Texas Instruments in the USA, but it's not as simple because there are fewer software libraries. Everything else is done in France. The electronic board is made by a company in the north of France near Lille, which manufactures the electronic board for us, and the casings are made from recycled plastic materials at Renault's plant in Flins.
Okay.
We've been incubated at what's called the Refactory. So Renault, through this hub they call the Future is Neutral, have built a way to kind of recycle the plant in Flins that used to make Zoe cars. And today it's become a circular economy hub. So they built an incubator. We went to this incubator in Flins for 9 months. And learned the practical basics of the circular economy and carbon footprint minimization. And it's on this basis that not only were we able to learn a lot and get into this circular economy network, but now we have square meters in the Flins Refactory on which the boxes are manufactured for us and assembled. In other words, the electronic boards come from Lille to Flins, are assembled, packaged, and then shipped.
Today, you tick a lot of boxes when it comes to raising funds, at least for impact projects. How did you finance the early days of DOT?
A la mano, in other words, for the time being, my co-founder and I have put our own money into the startup. It's all been personal funding. After a year, we received a French Tech Emergence grant from BPI France. Right, the maximum is 90,000 euros, so we were able to get this help from BPI France to strengthen the funds we had put in at the start. And that's it. That's all the public funding we've received so far. We've continued to do only, I would say, personal financing. We're back in the pot. All right. Right now, we've just done a very small round of financing with Love Money, with a few investors who are actually friends and friends of friends, who are passionate about the subject. And so far, we think we've actually started selling. In particular, we have a small B2B business that's involving the building of underground mesh networks. So that was our very first idea, which we haven't given up on. With the progress we've made in the sharing of GBs, we now have very good control over our equipment. Our hardware, as a result, we're able to pull off some amazing features of programming behind the scenes. And today, we have dots installed in really big factories of major players in the north and east of France, creating underground networks for tracking isolated workers in terms of safety.
That's a question I forgot to ask you. What kind of autonomy?
So the DOT in full streaming mode has an autonomy of about 24 hours. Basically, I pair it with my phone. My phone is power plugged, so it's not my phone that's going to break down. The dot is fully charged, it's not power connected, I turn it on and pair it, and then another phone connects to my dot and watches a 24-hour news channel, for example. And at that point, it'll last for 24 hours. All right, then.
It's conceivable that it could last much longer if you use, let's say, the classic internet.
Yes, that's it. If, for example, I share my dot, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours a day, I'll last a week, in which case I'll have one load a week at that point.
I interrupted you on funding. So you mentioned that you and your friends have made a small fundraising to further support your business and that you have a commercial activity. What is your next course of action when it comes to selling dots?
So what I'd like to do is, I don't know if we're going to raise funds. It's possible at some point to be able to accelerate, but I think we can get our sales off the ground, at least on the hardware sales side. After that, the big question for us will be whether it's worth raising funds with sales starting up on hardware, but without having yet proven the commission business. On transactions, could this be a good intermediate step? Or if we ever have prospects of sales of dots because of the success it may have at CES, and then after a little viral effect on, it's a thing, it's super cool, etc., then at that stage we may fund our growth in various ways, maybe through debt. We do not necessarily need to raise funds. So that's why we're going to have to take a look at how things are going.
We could even imagine community financing too.
Exactly. That's one of the things I'm looking into. I think that what we're going to do today is to avoid falling into two pitfalls at the moment. We are building a little stock, and this stock of dots will enable us to be present in the first quarter and first half of the year. If it's too big, we're going to find ourselves with a lot of stuff on the shelves, and that's going to become a bit of a cash crunch. And if we haven't done enough, we're going to lose credibility because people will be waiting and we won't be able to deliver. So for the moment, we're working on a kind of hybrid system between the two, i.e. we're going to launch a limited series. But as you can see, it has all the characteristics of a crowdfunding scheme, i.e. what we're going to do is build up a stock so we can start selling immediately. And then after that, we're going to do production waves based on pre-orders. I think that's how we're going to try to manage it, with the mindset of needing a minimum of extra working capital to be able to try and grow and then postpone our need for fundraising for probably at least a year.
Someone listening to this episode and thinking they like this idea, what's the best way to help?
Well, the best way to help is to order a dot, and that can be done easily. We're on pre-order today. There are two websites. There's a site that I think is the target site called shareyourgbs.com.
Okay.
Shareyourgbs.com.
Yeah.
One can leave their email address on that site, and we'll be able to enter both the newsletter and the first wave of people who will actually be able to place the order. We also have a site that's more, let's say, about the dot technology. So it also covers B2B activities, and it's simply called .dot.fr. But the GB sharing part is really shareyourgbs.com. So a dot order getting into the community, and then I think the best thing is to also set up blogs that will enable us to get customer feedback. And we'll be working a lot on improving the type of services and operation based on the feedback we get from our community.
A quick question that came to me as I listened to you. When you're in B2B sales, selling to groups that distribute dot to their employees, what's the motivation that's going to make employees start sharing their GBs and think about connecting their dot to their phone?
The first motivation we saw was the realization that, in fact, having GBs on a mobile subscription wasn't a matter of course for everyone. In fact, once people know about it, they'll say, well, so if I share my GBs, will that help people? Well, I'll do it. It doesn't cost me anything. I just have a dot to turn on. I'll put it on my desk. I'll do something else, and whoever walks by will either connect or not, and that's it. It's not an invasive act. It's an extremely simple thing to do. To give you an idea, we're in talks today with a car manufacturer who's even planning to install them in their vehicles. In fact, if you get close to one of my vehicles, there'll always be internet. and you don't have to be the owner of the dot to be able to pair it with your phone and share your GBs. So there's a real craze that's also due to the fact that today all companies, especially the biggest ones, have CSRD obligation on corporate responsibility. They have to issue CSRD reports. And today, the majority of actions within the CSRD framework are environmental actions, which are undeniably desirable. However, it is also undeniable that there is a social and solidarity aspect that is considerably harder to handle, since it essentially falls within the perimeter of labor unions. This means that for a company that has entered the field of solidarity, there's something that's a bit of a hot topic, but thanks to this initiative, it's not anymore. So it's an opportunity for companies to think, oh, my social contribution could be a tangible action. It's not just about collecting plastic caps and sending them to the recycling plant. It's more about being proactive and making the most of the company's greatest asset, its human resources. So seize the opportunity and tap into the company's potential, meaning the crowd of employees who are also there to represent what a company represents as a whole. So there will be employees who will say to themselves, I don't care about this story, it's not my thing. If they don't have an internet connection, too bad for them. And then a certain percentage of people will start doing it. But in any case, we feel that if at some point we don't try to push solidarity and make it concrete, it's not going to come on its own. So in fact, there are a lot of big groups who are quite sensitive to this idea because it costs them very little, and for them it's extremely real.
That's interesting. Are there any specific questions that you would have liked me to ask, but I failed to do so?
So no, first of all, I think all the questions you've asked me have made for a really interesting overview of DotDot. Thank you very much for that. So where will we be in 5 years' time? That's usually the question we get. I don't know if this one was planned.
It's a question you can answer.
Let's imagine that it works, that is, that it takes off. In fact, I think that in 2 years' time, we'll start to see transactional income from commissions on the peer-to-peer sales of GBs. I think that's a very important step for the company because it means we'll be able to enter a new phase of profitability and size, which is not the same as what we can achieve today with our disparate sales to isolated communities. And if all goes well, I think that in 5 years' time, we could reach a size in terms of number of users, a size that could be intermediate between the size of the biggest virtual mobile operators who are fighting a purely marketing business to sell GBs cheaply, banking on the fact that people don't consume all the GBs they're offered. This is the case for all virtual operators. It's the very principle of their business model. The biggest must have maybe 3 million users and smaller than the smallest incumbent operator with infrastructure. The big four, Free, SFR, Orange, and Bouygues, are really in a league of their own. But I think we can get into that niche, i.e. offer something that doesn't exist today, which is mobile on demand, and with added value, i.e. a symbiosis with some of these operators. Perhaps less so with virtual mobile operators than with incumbent operators, but I really believe in symbiosis, i.e. that the 15 to 20% of people who have difficulty connecting are also part of the reason for the churn rate of telephone operator subscriptions. So it's a notoriously difficult population for them to manage because in general it's a lot of manual calls, negotiations, staged payments, and so on. Whereas here it's very simple. You've taken out a subscription with us, maintaining it is difficult. So here's a dot, resell a bit of your GBs and remain our loyal customer. So I think that's how we could be in 5 years or so as an alternative mode of access to mobile internet that replaces neither the one nor the other.
And in France only, or to expand abroad?
Personally, I think that as soon as we can demonstrate the business model of the transaction, we'll probably have the means to raise enough funds to be able to go abroad. But it seems to me to be a good time, for example, to a sale or an IPO is to see the growth prospects of the transactional business, and at that point to have the resources to go abroad. I think it makes sense at that point, but I'm still firmly convinced that France is the place to start.
Let's move on to the last part, which is the improbable quiz. There are about 10 questions and you're allowed only one joker. Do you prefer tea or coffee? Coffee. How many a day? 3. Keep it reasonable, it's good.
Yes, it's reasonable, of course.
If you could hire a superhero to co-CEO with you, who would you choose?
A co-CEO with me? Neo in the Matrix, is this good enough?
It is! If DotDot were a flavor of ice cream, what would it be?
Ice cream flavor. Tiramisu?
If DotDot were a song, what would it be? Oh.
So it's wordless, but that's Impossible Mission Force.
It's a well-known tune too.
There you go.
What's the weirdest thing you've ever eaten at a business lunch?
Duck feet. When I went to China for the first time, I was invited to a restaurant, and basically out of politeness, I had to eat all the dishes presented to me. It was the first time in my life that I discovered that raw duck feet were eaten. The Chinese, many of them, are very fond of cartilage, which isn't my thing at all. So I had to eat raw duck feet, and that was a real pain.
If you could travel back in time, what era would you like to start in?
19th century, I think. Why? Well, because, and that's the image I have of it anyway, is that there were still so many things that appeared to be discovered. I mean, the electron was discovered particularly late, so I'm obviously putting myself in the situation where I would have had not the knowledge of the future, but I would have had the scientific knowledge, for example, to be there. And the impression that I'd finally managed to invent the foundations of mankind's knowledge. Today, we're very much into innovations that are innovations after so many things that have been done before. That's not to say that there aren't some really interesting things to do, but the basics of mankind, I have the impression that they were created a lot at that time.
Well, that's your background as an entrepreneur and researcher?
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
Do you prefer McDonald's or gastro?
Gastro.
Do you prefer Monday morning or Friday night?
I'm more of a Friday night person. Monday mornings are...
Do you cut out completely over the weekend?
I'd like to, but there are times when there are bursts of activity when I find it hard to cut out completely. My family tells me so, and I'm having a hard time right now. It's a hectic time with the CES and then the start of the business, so it's true that I'm a bit on adrenaline at the moment, and it's taking its toll on me.
Are you more Elon Musk or Bernard Arnault?
Joker.
Ah, voilà. What's the strangest thing you have in your office?
The strangest thing I have in my office? Lightsabers.
It works?
Yeah, they work, yeah. So every once in a while, it's fun. So we take out the lightsabers and then it's a fight to the death in the corridors.
No. Listen, Christophe, thank you very much for your time. If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do so?
LinkedIn works very well. I'm very loyal. So we have a DotDot account on LinkedIn. And if not, leave us a message on shareyourgbs.com. There, I'm the first recipient of all the emails that arrive on that channel. Shareyourgbs.com, and you're sure to get a reply from me in less than 24 hours.
Listen, we'll share our GBs with you. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, François.
See you soon.